Hi, my name is Chris Guiterman. I'm from the University of Arizona Laboratory of Tree Ring Research. My talk is entitled Drivers, Types, and Management Responses of Vegetation Type Conversion in the U.S. Southwest. As we've seen, the amount of area burned in the Western U.S. over the last several decades is on the rise. And with that comes an alarming trend that the amount of high severity burn area of those fires is also on the rise, particularly for the Southwest region, the Four Corner states, and some areas in California. So those high severity burn areas tend to have three trajectories, especially when looking here at ponderosa pine dominated stands, but this kind of goes for yellow pine stands and other dry conifer forests, frequent fire forests of the Western US. After a high severity fire, we tend to see three different trajectories. One, this sort of hyperdense conifer recruitment that could just reestablish the same sort of dog hair thicket forest structure that probably drove that high severity fire in the first place. The other two trajectories could be a vegetation type conversion. So on top here, we have dominance for herbaceous species, particularly grass, or resprouting shrub species, in this case, gamble oak. So we're thinking about these other two, and we're wondering just how common they are. Where are they, and what forest types and conditions do they occur? And then importantly, how are they managed? If this is an increasing trend, which we think it is, how are they being managed? So we held two workshops in 2019 to discuss vegetation type conversion and its management. One was in March in Tucson, and the other was in December in Sacramento. You can see here participants at the workshops kind of poring over these maps and working closely to try to identify areas that they knew to be type conversions or that they would consider as type conversions. And they're identifying those locations on these maps, this paper mapping exercise that we did. This included a lot of discussion. There were some interesting sort of, I won't say arguments, but we talked through like, is that really a type conversion? What does it look like? What are the species involved? We pulled up data and we kind of went through it. I'll say the groups sort of had trouble coming up with a consistent definition for what a type conversion is, but everybody seemed to know it when they saw it in the field. And I like this sort of phrasing from Craig Allen at USGS when he said a type conversion is something that is profound, extensive, and enduring. And I saw this same verbiage reflected in a paper led by Jonathan Koop last year in Bioscience. And I thought that fits really well with kind of what we're thinking is type conversion and what the participants in general thought of type conversion. So here's an example of one of those maps from that mapping exercise with these dots laid out on the landscape. You can see each dot has a number, and then the numbers correspond to these paper forms that went with it, where the participants were asked to describe the location of the VTC, the land ownership, the ecology or vegetation types prior to and following the type conversion event, when that event happened, what the driving mechanism was, so fire or something else, and what management actions are taking place, plus the species of interest. So we use this as kind of this engaging way to create a conversation and talk through these events. But when we started looking at them more in detail and compiling the data in a spreadsheet and trying to map out where those dots were actually referring to, because they're pretty coarse on these paper maps, we saw the potential in the data set to really be illustrative of what's happening in the ground to answer those questions that we had earlier on that I presented. So here are the type conversion events that we were provided by the participants in our workshops. There's 61 of them. We looked at where these happened and the high severity fires in which they were associated with, and supplemented management actions in the facts database from the Forest Service to try to see what was reported for management in those places. In a manuscript that we're preparing with the co-authors of this talk, and then also among participants at the meetings, we're describing 11 of them as case studies as well. So you can see on the map, we have all these examples kind of spread throughout. So they're a wide ranging geography. And we kind of divide things up into two different study regions. So we have the Southwest, which is Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, and California. So even though this is all the US Southwest, we really kind of break things out into these two different study areas because the results are a little bit different between them, and because each one had participants that were from those areas in terms of the two meetings that we had held. So in terms of the drivers of vegetative type conversion, you can see the high severity fire predominates everything. 80% in all of our examples originate in high severity fire. With drought, some biotic agents like bark beetles, elk in a couple cases, high frequency fire and land use change are driving other type conversions. So beginning with the big one, high severity fire, we see incidents like this. This is from the 2011 Los Conchas fire on the eastern side of the Jemez Mountains. This is the photograph I took 1 year later in an area that had already burned in 1996 in a dome fire. So two big high severity fires driven by wind through dense ponderosa pine dominated landscape. You get this, it's a dust bowl. You can see some herbaceous vegetation recovering, there's yellow flowers there. This area is now predominantly Gamble oak and New Mexico locust, so resprouting shrub species that took a little longer than the herbaceous vegetation recover, but came in and taken this area over. It's almost entirely depleted of living conifer trees. And we know that those high severity fires are not isolated incidents in and of themselves, right? We need to acknowledge that high severity fire is the result in most cases of long-term land use change and depriving these frequent fire forests of that vital ecological process, fire. So we see densification happening, and then that combined with aridity driven by climate change, we get more instances of high severity fire, larger patches of high severity fire because the forest fuels are more homogeneous. So we know that high severity fire has its own drivers, and the consequences of that high severity fire are what we're interested in. We also know that these type conversion events typically originate from compounding disturbances. So while I said the primary driver is one thing, and there's the other things that are also happening, multiple of those things are usually happening at any one site. So here's an example of an Engelmann spruce forest in the San Juan Mountains of Colorado that was attacked by bark beetles in the early 2000s and then burned very hot in 2013. So this compound disturbance event in a wilderness area really makes for some dramatic ecosystem change. So back to our drivers, looking at incidents that were attributed primarily to drought, we see areas like this in Southern California. This is Laguna Mountain that was hit by a series of droughts and then some fires and some bark beetles. So it's got it all, but the droughts were really labeled as the first thing that hit and also prevented the area from recovery. So planting operations here failed because of drought conditions. Here's another area. This is a relatively small patch, but it's ponderosa pine and Douglas fir on the Navajo Nation that are succumbing to drought and being replaced by Gamble oak. This is an expanding patch that's been ongoing for a while and remains quite a mystery, but it's an area that I noted as driven by drought. There's no fire and no bark beetles that I could tell, but they're probably in the system. Looking at high frequency fire, this is an interesting one, particularly in chaparral systems in the California coast. Here's an area north of San Francisco that in 1993 was kind of at the tail end of a long sort of multi-decadal fire return interval system. So it burns, but every so many decades. From 2007 to 2020, 5 fires impacted this slope and contributed to the loss of more than 60% of the chaparral vegetation. So you can see on the bottom photo, those white polygons are kind of the last refugia of chaparral on that slope. And at the bottom of the slope, the oak woodlands have also been pretty devastated by all of this fire. So this is high frequency fire related to the invasion of the area by cheatgrass, development, climate change, land use. So there's a lot of things going on driving these type conversions. They're quite extensive. Looking at the trajectories of type conversions, we see these arrows leading from one to the next. So forests going to shrubland is the one that really pops out in both of these. In the California study area, 54% of the type conversion examples related to or ended in shrub field, and 63% were shrubland in the Southwest. So both those dry mixed conifer forests and ponderosa pine really going to shrubland. In California, there are Jeffrey pine forests and ponderosa pine, other conifer forests going to shrubland. Here's an example of one of those in Southern California in Devil's Postpile National Monument. This is a 1992 fire that took out all of these very large conifers. You can see on the right side, there's, these are huge trees. And now you have the short statured shrubland left behind. The left is an aerial photo. You can see that waterfall kind of in the center of the photograph there to give you a sense of the scale of this patch. Another example, some previous work of my own, looking at the Jemez Mountains landscape. You can see in blue are Gamble oak dominated shrublands that are embedded in this dry conifer forest dominated by ponderosa pine. The distribution of those shrublands as of the late 1900s was about 4.75% of the landscape, so less than 5% of the landscape in shrubland. After the Los Conchas fire, which again burned through several different other high severity fires like the Cerro Grande, the Dome Fire, and so forth, colleagues mapped out these two 10,000 hectare patches that are on the east side of the Jemez. So just those two patches, which are now known to have really converted to mostly Gamble oak, but also I said New Mexico locust and other species. You add that up, and now the distribution of shrubland in the Jemez Mountains is more than 13%. So dramatic, almost tripling of the amount of area in shrubland because of this suite of fires over the last couple decades. Again, looking at the trajectories, we see just a little bit of sagebrush and chaparral converting to non-native grassland, like I told you from the Putty Creek watershed earlier. But it's important to emphasize that this sagebrush conversion is actually wildly extensive, covering huge areas of the Great Basin in Nevada and Utah, and going even north of that. So this is really related to invasion of cheatgrass, high frequency fire, and climate change, but didn't really come through in our results that much. And that's probably just because of the representation of ecological professions at our workshops. How are these sites being managed? Well, the workshop participants talked through about 3 different types of management activities that they're seeing on the landscape. The first is to reverse change, so push the system back toward its pre-disturbance state or some other desirable target like a pre-fire exclusion forest structure. Observe change, so be patient, monitor, watch, see where the system's going, see if you need to do anything, but be on it. Facilitate change, so push the system along some new alternative, potentially novel trajectory. And we referenced the RAD framework, so the resist, accept, direct framework here, which has taken on a lot of popularity in the last year or so, and looks to be a really useful way of thinking about management in these sorts of instances. We weren't using that language at the time of the workshop, so we kind of try to maintain our language, but show that there are interactions here. So in terms of how these sites were managed, we see a lot in reverse change, very little in observe or facilitate. And then we have this box over here with no management or it wasn't provided to us. And there's a couple of reasons for this, but it's important to note that more than a third of the sites, we either don't know what's happening there or the participants didn't, or there actually is nothing happening there. So we'll come back to that a little bit, but first let's go to the big one, which is reverse change. So more than half of the sites and 73% of the sites in California are under known reverse change actions. A lot of those are planting operations, so planting conifer species. 5 were known to have already failed of the 21 that were reported to us, and several others had doubt expressed toward them that it was planted, but it's not going to make it. This generated a lot of discussion in the workshops about targeted planting versus more traditional grid layouts or pines and lines, as you might hear. In the efficacy of either one of those or both of those. I'll note that there's an example I'll show you in a minute from the U.S. Forest Service lands in Colorado in the Front Range that achieved greater than 75% survivorship after 3 years in their planting trials in the Hayman fire. And those 3 years were pretty bad for drought. So this idea of targeted planting in beneficial areas that might have high efficacy, like seeps and springs, wet areas, upper elevation sites, productive soils, more sheltered or north aspects, in using nurse log structure, things like that could help reduce drought impacts on plantation seedlings, help in terms of survivorship. People also noted, but we didn't analyze, that private plantations are probably doing better than on public lands, mainly because of their ability to invest in vegetation management at those sites. So those plantations seem to be doing okay, whereas on Forest Service lands, we're getting kind of these lower rates of success. Looking at the FACTS data, so these are treatments within high severity burn patches. Over half of our sites we were able to identify on in the FACTS database. And when we started looking at trends through time and the types of management activities that are being reported within those sites, we see commercial tree removal, planting, non-commercial fuels reduction, and observation. You'll note that in California, on the left side here, in the first 5 years, there's a lot of activity going on. All the first 3, not really observation as much, but they get in there and they do stuff. And some of that is salvage logging, which brings about some other questions on the efficacy of salvage logging in terms of recovery of these sites. But after 5 years, the amount of activity wanes pretty dramatically. Whereas in the Southwest, it either stays constant, it kind of goes up in terms of tree planting out to about 20 years. You're seeing generally some more increased tree planting with a lot of observation in the first 5 years. So this may help explain why so many of those sites were either classified as no management or not sure, because if they're within the last 10 years, which many of them were, we're just not seeing management yet. That doesn't mean it won't happen. If the Forest Service is putting them under observation, or even passively, like our participants, many of whom work for the Forest Service, know about them, they may very well go back and do some actions in there. But one thing that we found in facts that I was surprised by was that the amount of land being managed within these burn patches. So here's that example from the Hayman fire in the Front Range of Colorado. You can see the green polygons are areas that are being planted, and they represent a pretty small portion of that burn area, and particularly of the high severity burn areas within it. So the dark red are patches of high severity fire, and just little bits here and there are being planted. On average, we're seeing less than a quarter of the burn patches getting treated. So the treatments are very targeted and not nearly covering the amount of type conversion that's actually happening on the landscape. So that may be a problem going forward, that our management is just not catching up. So to conclude, we're finding that type conversion is affecting nearly all forest types in these 3 states that we looked at, from lower elevation woodlands all the way to subalpine forests. They're predominantly driven by fire, but again, the fire in itself is driven by other factors, and the combinations of disturbances are really important for type conversion. In general, we're finding that the trajectories of these type converted areas are towards something more homogeneous, shorter in stature, and highly disturbance adapted. So forests to shrubs, shrubs to grass. About half of the areas that we learned about and were provided to us are under active recovery efforts, trying to push those back, but with varying success. And what we're seeing is that less than a quarter of those affected areas are actually receiving treatment, in terms of numbers. So I'd like to thank the workshop participants from 2019, the co-authors on this paper. Again, some of those workshop participants are helping us to write up this study. Hopefully we'll get that submitted soon. We have funding from the U.S. Geological Survey Southwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. And thank you for listening and watching. And if you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to contact me. My email is there at the bottom. Thank you very much.